coming up on this episode of the Roundtable.
So the dirty little secret in American politics today is that the people we elect to run the government, they're no longer the ones who actually run the government. Do we believe that the right immigration policy is one that should protect American workers from the effects of foreign wage competition? Or do we believe the right immigration policy is one that enriches and fosters a stronger national identity, civic identity in the United States? And the book is called Truths, but it's predicated on the thesis that America was founded on, which is that the path to truth runs through free speech and open debate. And that is what this book hopes to spawn by saying some things that, had I said them in the 1990s, I would advise you not to buy the book because they were too mundane. Yet today, my caution to you might be that some of the things that you read in the book are so controversial that they might get you in trouble.
Well, welcome, Vivek Ramaswamy, to a special edition of the American Mind podcast and video. We're here to talk about your new book, Truths, The Future of America First. Really enjoy you being with us here today. I want to run through first the truths, and then we can get into some discussion of the book. They are: God is real, the climate change agenda is a hoax, an open border is not a border, there are two genders, there are three branches of U.S. government, not four. The nuclear family is the greatest form of governance known to mankind. Reverse racism is racism. Nationalism isn't a bad word. Facts are not conspiracies. And then my favorite, the U.S. Constitution is the strongest guarantor of freedom in history. Before we get into some particular questions, Vivek, what was your main goal with this book? I knew it grew out of your 2024 presidential campaign and talking to people and wanting to convey to the American people the lessons you learned from there and lessons you've learned from your longer venture into public service and also your experience in the private sector. But what do you really want to get out of this book?
Yeah, look, this is the fourth book I've written in the last 4 years, and it's different than all of the other ones I've written. I hope it's going to have the most practical impact on the country, because my goal with this book is to start opening up conversations that we're not otherwise having. We're saying one thing at the dinner table, yet most people are afraid to say that in public. And so the goal with this book is to close that gap. It's different than the other books in that this isn't an academic exposition. It's actually a book that's very pragmatic. Every chapter ends with 5 truths, 5 hard facts, or 5 core arguments distilled in 1 to 2 sentences at the end of each chapter that allow somebody, generally a right of center individual who may be afraid or unable to articulate the core points they want to make to a left-leaning friend or colleague. That's what this book hopefully equips the reader to be able to do. And so it is a different kind of book, but I do believe it's going to be the most impactful book that I've written in terms of actually opening up discourse in the country. And the book is called Truths, but it's predicated on the thesis that America was founded on, which is that the path to truth runs through free speech and open debate. And that is what this book hopes to spawn by saying some things that, had I said them in the 1990s, I would advise you not to buy the book because they were too mundane. Yet today, my caution to you might be that some of the things that you read in the book are so controversial that they might get you in trouble. That itself, I think, shows how far our nation has progressed in the last 30 years. And I'm hoping to change this for the better.
Yeah, we'll get into the gender chapter, but at one point you're right.
Yeah.
You describe the anatomy of a man and a woman and what they are, and you write right after, I never thought I'd have to write that sentence, but that's where we are. We don't have time to cover all 10 truths, but I'll just mention that the book is coming out September 24th. Everyone should buy it. We'll have those details in the show notes. I wanted to start with immigration, the chapter titled "An Open Border is Not a Border." You talk about asylum and the kind of scam it's become. It's become a kind of victim Olympics, as you put it in the book, which I thought was a great phrase. And you talk about the problem of the wide disparities of enforcement by judges. And so my question that grew out of that is there some way we should go after the abusive judges? It doesn't seem to be that many of them. And you have this phenomenon of, 90% of the cases in front of one judge getting asylum granted, and then some other judge, maybe down in Texas versus California, denying most asylum. Is that the right approach to go after the judges?
So I think that is an approach that sets, I think, some difficult precedents versus a much easier approach, which starts with the executive branch itself. People forget this, but our justice system actually depends not just on the judges, but it depends on the integrity of a prosecutorial system that's actually bringing the right kinds of cases, enforcing the rule of law as it exists, and in some cases, appearing to enforce laws that actually don't exist. And so what I see at the southern border in many ways is a symptom of a deeper abandonment of the rule of law in the United States. Even the weaponization of the justice system against its political opponents in Washington, D.C., or through three-letter agencies is really just a symptom of that same deeper malaise that you now see with respect to our immigration system, in which case many cases are not enforced for the same reasons that politicized cases of a different kind are enforced. So I think part of what we need is not just going after and playing whack-a-mole with individual judges. That's more of a symptomatic therapy. I think the deeper fix actually starts with the executive branch, both at the federal and state level, of judges, not just judges, but prosecutors who view the law as their motivation rather than as an inconvenient constraint. And the dirty little secret in, I think, modern justice departments, both at the federal and state level, is that most of the people who sit in those seats, and the same thing goes for regulatory enforcement agencies, is they view this law as a pesky inconvenience that constrains this other thing that they otherwise want to do. Versus if you're in a Department of Justice or an otherwise a regulatory enforcement agency, the law itself should be your raison d'etre. It should be your core motivating reason for why you acted in the first place. And I think that cultural shift in the executive branch is, I think, actually far more impactful and likely to succeed than playing whack-a-mole with individual judges.
Yeah, no, that's probably right. It's just a matter of executive will, and we've seen the stark differences between one administration and the other on this front. You make the good point that investment in border security should pay lots of dividends down the road. I'm just curious, have you run across a white paper that tries to calculate the savings if we actually cut this flow down, even by 50%, let alone, 70, 80, 90%?
It's probably a good call to action coming out of this, that some academic somewhere hears this, because I think that's actually a white space that does not exist. Yeah. And, it's like I come from the private sector, of course, but in the world of business, or you want to pursue an opportunity as an entrepreneur or an investor picking a stock in public markets, you want to pick the most obvious bet you can make that other people don't see at the same time. So that translates to the realm of academia. You probably hit the nail on the head for your most undervalued academic exposition is some attempt, a model to quantify what the actual dollar value savings would be of fixed dollar value investments, like moving our own military to the southern border, completing the construction of the southern border wall. Probably the highest ROI bet we could make is the use of aquatic barriers in the Rio Grande. They're cheap, they're mobile. And so I do think quantifying that in an ROI term is I didn't quite do that in this book. I lay out enough facts that make clear that the ROI would be high. But if somebody wants to take that and run with it coming out of this book and turn it into an academic white paper, more power to them. It'd be good for the country.
Yeah, any donors out there listening should give Mark Krikorian some money to do this at the Center for Immigration Studies, maybe. I wanted to, before we move on from immigration, I wanted to highlight a mutual interest and agreement of ours. At the Claremont Institute, we've been against birthright citizenship for a long time, and it's a controversial position, but if you could just give us a quick précis on the problem of it.
Sure. So I have a very narrowly scoped view here, which is that birthright citizenship does not apply to the kids of illegal entrance to the country. And I think that this dates back, is wrongly understood to date back to one interpretation of the Wong Kim Ark case, where, the thought process was just because somebody was, born in the United States, it's been extrapolated to believe from that case that automatic physical location of birth automatically confers citizenship. And one of the easiest ways to just debunk that myth is with the hard fact that somebody who's a diplomat in this country, who's here legally, if their kid is physically born on U.S. soil, they don't enjoy U.S. citizenship, right? They enjoy citizenship of their prior country or the country from which their parents were diplomats, but not that of the United States. Invading soldiers who invade the United States of America and have a child here, let's just say a woman has a child here and she's the spouse of an invading soldier, that kid does not enjoy birthright citizenship. And so on that same logic, the kid of somebody who's here illegally doesn't quite enjoy birthright citizenship either. I use that by way of analogy. It's not exactly the legal argument, but it allows people to understand the core legal argument that birthright citizenship is confined in the scope to whom it applies, I believe, under existing law already. So I think this does not require a change in constitutional amendment. I don't think it requires a statute. I think it requires a chief executive, a president of the United States, who's willing to, with a spine, swear an oath to the Constitution and keep it with a deep understanding of what that 14th Amendment really means. The opening words of the 14th Amendment, Section 1, says all persons born or naturalized in the United States and subject to the jurisdiction thereof. Those are the key words. are citizens. I think word for word, those are the opening words of the 14th Amendment. And I think we in America deserve a class of politician that when they swear an oath to the Constitution, they might as well have read it and known what it actually means. And if they do, I think that there goes this idea that the kids of illegal aliens automatically do enjoy birthright citizenship. I will say that the book touches on this, gets to the doorstep of this, but I really in the introduction and even in the preface and in the prologue to the book touch on this issue too, is sometimes the vehemence of our opposition to illegal immigration, which I share, of course, in some ways confounds a brewing debate on the right with respect to what our attitudes are or should be towards legal immigration. And I think in the book's called Truths, the Future of America First. But I think that hard truth for the America First movement to confront is there is a brewing debate in not just among conservatives, but even within the America First right, America First conservatives, about what that right immigration policy should be. And I think that that's what this book begins to do, is at least spawns that debate that I think we're going to have over the next 3-4 years. Do we believe that the right immigration policy is one that should protect American workers from the effects of foreign wage competition? Or do we believe the right immigration policy is one that enriches and fosters a stronger national identity, civic identity in the United States? Those are two, I wouldn't say competing goals, but they're orthogonal goals. And the immigration policy we set up on the legal side is probably even the tougher question ahead once we have solved the illegal mass migration crisis. In some ways, that's going to be very hard to do logistically. But normatively, that's the easier part. The harder part is defining where we as a conservative movement land on the question of legal immigration. And that's a debate that I look forward to, not in the next 50 days or whatever to the election, but after that. I do think it's going to be uncomfortable but important terrain for us to cover as a movement.
Yeah, I think so as well. And as you say, there are competing views. Let's talk about gender some. The truth is there are two genders. I was having a conversation, and I'm interested to get your perspective because you've worked in this space. One of friends of Claremont runs a small, well, not that small, but pharmaceutical company that specializes in genetic disorders. And he said maybe last month to me, when we were having a conversation, that he's worried that, well, not worried, but he's very interested in the pace of technological progress on this. And you bring up eye color as your example of, if you're brown-eyed, you can't just identify as blue-eyed. There are certain biological truths. But he says we're fairly close to being able to, I forget if it's through an injection or a pill or whatever, change eye color. How are we to understand this immutability conversation with this very rapidly progressing ability to change genetics in some ways?
Yeah, look, I think that what is and what should be are two different questions. Yeah. I don't have strong moral intuitions about the permissibility of changing eye color. I think that I actually have no moral objection to that, right? And I also have no moral objection to an adult attempting to change the physical attributes of his or her gender. I do have a problem with turning that into an ideology that's foisted onto a culture and a country, especially through the indoctrination and intervention, surgical or chemical intervention in children, who we acknowledge are not fully formed adults. In all other respects, you can't smoke a cigarette or have a tattoo by the age of 18. I don't think you should be able to undergo genital mutilation or chemical castration by the age of 18 until you're a fully formed consenting adult. If you're free to identify as a woman, you're free to say you swam in a swimming pool and wear whatever swimsuit you want to wear, as long as you're not hurting somebody else in the process. But you're not free to win a trophy at the end of it just because you claim to be a woman when in fact you're a biological man. So I think that there's a distinction between what you're entitled to. It's a distinction between your own rights and your freedoms from government intervention, from your claim on using state or state affiliated intervention to actually advance your own substantive goals. And I think that's what the LGBTQIA, there's so many letters, they put a plus at the end of it, has managed to achieve, is that in the name of fighting for rights, they've actually created an imposition and an infringement on the rights of others while using substantive, hefty government muscular intervention at times to achieve their stated goals. And that's where I have a problem. Now, let's just get to the underlying truth. We get to the biology, which is where you began. I think it's worth observing, and I do touch on this in the book, and I credit a friend of mine, Douglas Murray, for pointing, in the book I do, for sort of pointing out the intellectual progenitor to this concept, is that in the case of gender at least, there's a bit of a paradox with the idea that the sex of the person you're attracted to, we presume and widely accept, is hardwired on the day you're born. We have to accept that. In fact, if you don't accept that, you might be in some hot water in today's social currents, because that was the core argument that formed the basis for gay rights to be framed as civil rights, right? That it's an immutable characteristic. The sex of the person you're attracted to is hardwired on the day you're born. And yet now in the LGBTQIA plus alphabet soup, that movement now asks you to at the same time believe that even though the sex of the person you're attracted to is hardwired at birth, your own biological sex is completely fluid over the course of your lifetime. There's at least a contradictory premise baked into that. And that contradiction becomes more severe against the backdrop of biological reality that there is no gay gene. There is no genetic basis for the sex of the person you're attracted to. Yet that's the attribute that we said is hardwired at birth.
Yeah.
Yet they're not only, it's not a gender chromosome. There are gender gene. There are two sex chromosomes. 2 X's you're a woman, an X and a Y you're a man, that hardwire and determine whether or not you're a man or a woman. And this is hardwired into evolution. This isn't just into evolutionary biology. This isn't just a matter of eye color here. Procreation via basically asexual reproduction versus sexual reproduction, just at the level of species, dating way back in evolutionary history, is actually foundational, because what we found is sexual reproduction is far more efficient for not only reproduction, but for the propagation of genetic diversity, versus asexual reproduction, which exists in certain ultra primitive species, but barely, exists in sorts of other forms of developed creatures. And so the fact that it's that foundational, and the fact that we then accept this otherwise contradiction that denies that biological reality of biological sex, while now embracing it for the total separate reality of sexual attraction, should at least cause people to at least step back from their presuppositions and say, hey, we are willing to re-examine what is biologically true, even against the face of social pressure that discourages you from asking that question.
Yeah, the other contradiction you point out rightly is that the transgender movement would not claim that they have some sort of disorder that is in need of medical treatment, yet at the same time they want others to pay for their medical treatment. I wonder, I think the sort of foundational question that divides us in many ways is this different understanding of rights. The older founding version, rights are immutable, natural, we can know them by reason, whereas this newer progressive view of rights is something like, if your desire coupled with your sense of individual autonomy means you want something and you're a big enough interest group to lobby for it, that somehow becomes a right. And as you pointed out, then other people have to pay for you to realize it.
Mm-hmm. And that's an old political philosophical distinction between negative rights and positive rights. Yeah. And America, I believe, is founded on a vision of negative rights, which are rights that stop the government from interfering in the way you live your life. My own view towards somebody who's gay or lesbian or transgender or queer or asexual, or, go straight down the list for the LGBTQIA, acronym, is you're free to live your life how you want, marry who you want, if you want, without the government standing in your way. But that doesn't mean that men get to compete with women in women's sports competitions. And it doesn't mean that you should be forced to officiate a wedding that you don't want to officiate. That's what true freedom really looks like to me, not the idea that somebody else is forced to pay for your gender conversion therapy of your kids, who might themselves regret it 20 years from now when they actually become fully formed adults. And one more word on this is there was an actually very interesting Supreme Court case. I think it just came out last year, certainly in the last couple of years, but I believe it was last year, which actually was deemed as a victory for trans rights activists, which was to claim that these surgeries are covered by the Americans with Disabilities Act. So if it was a victory for trans rights to say that we want this classified under the laws of disability for the purpose of welfare state payments, then it should at least cause someone to think twice, as many have called me, a lot of names, for saying that transgenderism is generally, and certainly in kids, a mental health disorder. You can't both shout down somebody who says that, which is consistently how the DSM-5 and physicians have characterized it for most of history, while also saying it's a victory to call it a disability for the purpose of collecting money, but otherwise you can't say it's a disorder. That again is at least, I think, a contradiction that at least hopefully would cause people to reflect on their openness to having this conversation.
Yeah, I think so. I want to cover something very close to our institutional hearts at the Claremont Institute, and it's the chapter on the administrative state, a boring term, but the chapter is called "There Are Three Branches of Government, Not Four." And you say it's about the procedure of how we do government rather than about the rules, which is a lot of what the rest of the book is about. But you say it might be the most important chapter in the book. And I want to bring up this example of the SEC so that we can kind of get into this. You talk about, back in the Federalist Papers, Madison said one way to keep government under control is to make sure that Congress abides by its own laws.
Yeah.
If they can pass one set of laws for the populace and then exempt themselves, you have a problem. The SEC, in your example in here, and it applies to other agencies as well, seems to be a double problem, which is the SEC requires transparency and monitoring of all sorts of communications of people working at financial firms, but then they themselves have been caught using offline communications and encrypted chats to avoid their own transparency. So I think the double problem with them is that they're doing that, and that's kind of a violation of the spirit of Madison. But then at the same time, they don't face the electorate at all, and they're not really removable at all by the president. So it's really quite a devolution from constitutionalism.
Yeah, I mean, that particular agency, like so many others, I think has become a lawless agency. And I think an agency loses its legitimacy. It becomes an illegitimate agency if it's itself supposedly in the name of enforcing the law, actually abandoning the rule of law. Don't take my word for it. Take that of the federal courts, which for the SEC, the EPA, the FTC, and countless other agencies, but certainly those included, the ones that I named, have repeatedly, in a diverse range of appellate courts across different circuits and districts across this country, put these agencies in their place. The case of the SEC, there was recently a federal court which actually even sanctioned them. It imposed actual fines on the SEC for its blatant abuse of authority that they were never actually given. EPA, same story with West Virginia versus EPA. That's a case where the EPA wrote out regulations that Congress never actually authorized. And in that major case, the Supreme Court just said, those rules are not rules that have the force of law. I'm sorry. If you want to actually pass rules that bind people, for that not to be an edict, that's what it used to be in England. It's an edict. Somebody writes it, a king writes it, that's an edict. We're not a nation of edicts, we're a nation of laws. And for it to be a law in the United States of America, you go through the constitutionally ordained process of lawmaking. That's what's missing in so many of these agencies. So the dirty little secret in American politics today is that the people we elect to run the government, they're no longer the ones who actually run the government. But the current Supreme Court, I think, this is very recent, dramatically changed that landscape to really uncover the way in which so many of these agencies, including the ones that you named, are effectively behaving as lawless creatures. They're illegitimate institutions as a consequence. And the federal courts have so far been the last bastion of correcting that. But once the people of this country see it, that's a big part of what draining the swamp is really all about. That's what it actually means, is to gut that bureaucratic apparatus to make sure that people who were never elected and couldn't be removed from office aren't actually writing rules that have the effect of laws and binding people that are affecting small business owners, large business owners, individuals, entrepreneurs across this country. It's the greatest wet blanket on our economy is the overgrowth of the regulatory state. But it's not just an economic point. It is the defining threat to self-governance in the United States of America as well. And I don't care whether you're on the left or the right. We may have different views on what the laws ought to be, and that's fine. It's the beauty of America. But let's adjudicate that through the democratic process and the constitutionally ordained process of rulemaking in Congress, rather than through the back door, which is what a lot of these lawless bureaucrats actually are doing today. I personally think we need to see a 3 strikes and out model. You've heard that in terms of going after violent criminals or whatnot in places like at the state level, places like California, they brought up these idea of 3 strikes and you're out. Why not apply that to our own overreaching government bureaucrats? If they lose 3 times in a row within a certain amount of time on a question of law before the courts, there's no reason for the public to believe that any of the other rules propagated or supposedly enforced by that agency have legitimacy either. So I do think that is a tidal wave about to come. I give the Supreme Court immense credit for reviving our constitutional first principle, which is that there are 3 branches of government with checks and balances without this 4th branch, this Leviathan, this shadow government that actually wields, unfortunately, the greatest amount of power today.
Yeah, that important case, of course, came out after you finished writing the book in June, Loper Bright. And the example is, the details of it are interesting. You say a litmus test in the book you write, a litmus test for regulation should be if Congress would have never passed it, then obviously there's something bad going on. And in that case, they were regulating fishermen and planting government agents on the boats to make sure they were doing it correctly, and then making the fishermen pay for the agents to be on the boat for all day, and the Supreme Court overturned it. So that was definitely some progress. Yeah. You talk about litigation and then especially executive action to correct a lot of the problem of the administrative state. You don't mention Congress much. What's Congress's role in this whole business?
Well, Congress's role is to take back accountability.
Yeah.
The dirty little secret behind the overgrowth of the administrative state is it wasn't just the bureaucrats. Yeah. It was a kind of Faustian bargain with the people who were elected to those positions in the first place, who, in many ways, deep down inside, didn't want that accountability, right? So they get the ability, right? What do most congressmen and senators, and many of them certainly these days want to do? They want to go on cable television at night and rail and pontificate. Well, they have it in some ways the best of all worlds, because they get to complain as though they're just some sort of television commentator, when in fact they're supposed to be the lawmakers. And yet by delegating their authority to these three-letter agencies, they actually create the world in which the people who are really exercising power aren't the people who appear in cable televisions. Everybody gets what they want out of the trade. The back office bureaucrat sitting in the drab office is the one that actually wields all the power. With the stroke of a pen, write regulations, go investigate people. Until recently, the Supreme Court in SEC versus Jarkissi overturned this practice. Also had judges who sit within those agencies, right, adjudicating the law. Judge, jury, executioner, prosecutor, and rule writer all under one agency. Well, you know what? That's only possible because Congress gave them that authority. So the congressmen get to show up on TV, feel important that way. The people who actually are important don't have to show up on TV. That means there's no accountability. It's almost that everybody gets what they want out of this ugly trade. But what we really need out of Congress is to restore accountability, to almost have, you could have a blanket statute that says any sort of delegation of administrative authority that exceeds the bounds of the major questions doctrine in West Virginia versus EPA, we, for avoidance of doubt, reclaim that latitude, and the rulemaking authority from those agencies is automatically gutted. Reform the Administrative Procedures Act, the APA, that otherwise through a set of ritualistic hoops that agencies jump through, what they call notice and comment periods or whatever, somehow confer upon them by saying a couple of the right shibboleths the ability to pass laws without going through actually Congress. No, we should reform the APA as well. So there is a role for Congress, but it's such a broken regime in the way Congress is run that I see a lot lower hanging fruit for the executive branch itself to adopt a position of humility. Right? People have pressed me at times and say, "Oh, is this executive governing by fiat?" No. The status quo is governing by fiat. The executive branch has exercised far more power than it ought to, or than our framers ever envisioned. But a chief executive who says we're putting an end to that through executive action by the U.S. president to take that power back and give it back to the people, to be able to actually say that we need to see that made through Congress, that's actually a restraint on executive power. And using executive power to exhibit restraint, I don't think is executive overreach. And I think that that's one of the things that I expose in this book is and especially in that chapter, we go into some level of legal depth. I think there's a point in the chapter where I warn the reader to say, okay, if you don't really want to go into great constitutional legal depth, you could just end this chapter here and move on to the next one. We got to be careful to make this practical for a broad readership. And as I said, the book is not an academic exposition. With one exception, perhaps that chapter, has an element of an academic exposition to it, but it was required. I think nobody on the right, outside of academics, but who have been in the political sphere, have really taken this on in a serious way. And so I felt compelled to do that in this portion of the book.
Yeah, and the virtue of the president taking it on too is, as you know, there are hundreds of examples of just egregious abuse that could be deployed rhetorically to bring the American people along, and then hopefully even force or bludgeon Congress a bit to do something about it while he's doing something as well. So yeah, it's a great ripe for opportunity. I want to talk about the chapter on the nuclear family. You make a compelling case for libertarians being in favor of good family policy. And you mentioned the example of Hungary and their kind of extraordinary incentive structure for family formation, for the bringing up or for the begetting and raising of children. But you say that the Hungarian model is almost surely not the right answer in the US. My question is, why not? And especially a couple pages later, you talk about how the American military has all sorts of incentives, financial especially, to prod people to get married and to encourage marriage. And it's resulted in a marriage culture in the US military that looks kind of like the 1950s. So why is the Hungarian model not quite right for us?
Well, look, I'm a deeply pro-family American, and not only in the way I live my life, but in the life that I want to be available to everybody else who wants to live in a similar way. I think the nuclear family is the grounding unit for every flourishing society through human history, and certainly this country. Aristotle, even dating back to, antiquity, was of the view that the household is the unit building block around which the polity is built. And I think that's true in our constitutional republic today as well. I think libertarians shy away from this issue. I actually do have strong liberty-leaning instincts myself, but I actually think that you avoid the need for the overexpansive welfare state and entitlement state we've created in this country if you actually did have greater family formation. What I see, though, as the most productive next step is actually we have severe disincentives for family formation in the United States today, including financial disincentives. And I just think that it will both be sufficient, and it is the right step without setting precedents of muscular state intervention of a kind that I just don't think we need, to be able to roll back those disincentives. And also, I think, reset a cultural tone in this country that isn't necessarily just going to come from the government, but is going to come, I think, from a cultural revival of the kinds of, everything from the kinds of movies we make to the books we write, to the example of the kind of person we have in the White House, the example we set as well, sets a certain national tone and character that I think is the right way to do it in the American context without using, muscular state intervention to achieve our substantive vision of the good. Problem with that is the same shoe fits the other foot, and it's exactly how we got to government disincentives to achieve family formation in the first place. So, I wanted to communicate with the reader, there are models for doing this through muscular state intervention in countries that are built on those bones, like Hungary, which I respect and have been wildly successful. But in America, we got to do it the American way. And I think the way we do it the American way is through bottom-up change in our culture that largely starts outside of politics. And even since leaving the campaign, I've done a lot outside of politics to try to drive change through our culture. Writing this book, I was an executive producer on another movie, started companies that make possible what the government isn't today. I don't think all change should be driven by the government. But what should be driven by the government is eliminate every one of those disincentives for family formation. And that's the case I make in the chapter.
Yeah. And I think, economists who've studied it are skeptical of the, despite Hungary's success, skeptical of the financial incentives resulting in more children. But the one thing that you didn't talk about is just outside the scope of your chapter, I think, is, you bring down the cost of housing, and it's the one thing actually that makes
totally
childbearing easier. It's pretty obvious, obviously.
We talk about that in the chapter as well. There's a lot of zoning restrictions. There's a lot of disincentives for increasing the supply of housing, especially smaller family homes, and rip those back. You bring housing costs down in this country automatically. It's one of the better pro-family policies you could imagine.
Yeah. I want to talk about racism. I remember we were watching the debate the other night. The moderator said, I was with my wife, and the moderator said, "No, let's talk about race." And she groaned and said, "I don't want to hear about race from either of these people," but that's neither here nor there. You talk about how Title VII of the Civil Rights Act makes the discrimination question easy in a way. And the title of the chapter is "Reverse Racism is Racism." It's easy in the sense that the language of Title VII bars discrimination based on race and sex. But is it easy? I guess my one question is, really the rub is, what does discrimination mean? In that older understanding, it was malicious, intentional discrimination. And on the left these days, they have a very different notion of discrimination. So, I mean, is that really where we're disagreeing more than anything, you think?
Yeah, I think we disagree on the postmodern turn. I mean, Ibram Kendi, I think, summarized it reasonably well. I don't agree with the view, but it summarized it reasonably well when he said, the remedy to past discrimination is present discrimination. The remedy to present discrimination is future discrimination. I disagree with that worldview, but at least it's a well-articulated worldview. And, I think the question is, do you believe in the John Roberts view of the matter, which is that the way to stop discrimination on the basis of race is to stop discriminating on the basis of race? That's the school of thought I come from. And I think that one of the things I try to do in this chapter is to reveal how it has betrayed the very people it was supposed to even help. I said the affirmative action regime, obviously, on its own face, definitionally is a form of anti-white and anti-Asian racism. But it's not just that. I think it has also spawned, and I do think there is a new wave of anti-Black racism in the United States today that did not exist as recently as 10 years ago or 20 years ago. And I think the reason why is there's no better way to foster racial animus towards a group than to take something away from another group on the basis of their skin color. Was there a time and place for reparations in the United States? Yeah, I do think there was, actually. I think it was in approximately 1870, thereabouts, in the Reconstruction era. There were reparations, actually, where they have a scale that were sufficient to, at that point, for the people who themselves had been treated as property or had property taken away from them. Was it sufficient to restore them to full parity? I don't think so. But at a certain point in time, and I think we've long passed that point in time, the right answer left for a country is to turn the page and move on, to let the final burning embers of racism slowly burn away, rather than to pretend like you're throwing water when in fact it's kerosene that causes the same cycle to flare up again. It's like an immune system that remains active long after it's basically cleared the virus. You end up killing the host in the process. And that's what I see happening in this country with the, it's a bit of a paradox that it's right when you get to the place that Martin Luther King might have imagined, might have been a country that looks a lot like the one we have right now in the year 2024, where you could say, are there final vestiges of racism? There kind of always will be in any culture anywhere. But from my vantage point, certainly to the point of functional irrelevance in America, it's not literally zero, but we would do fine rounding it down and having policies that basically acknowledge that we move past the racism of the past in the United States. It's precisely then that the claims of the anti-racist movement have become most histrionic, that we're a systemically racist country that was founded in 1619 rather than 1776. It's at least a bit of a paradox that it's right when we've achieved our proximity to Martin Luther King's promised land, once envisioned, that we have the most shrill claims about racism in the country as we've ever had. And, I think that there's something deeper going on that's an undercurrent that connects a lot of the chapters here, which is this deeper hunger for purpose and meaning and identity that we miss in our country. And we relocate those purpose-driven instincts to Civil Rights Act or civil rights movements, that once you've reached your goal, in some sense, you're now missing that purpose that filled your heart, that sense of cause that guided you, and you start acting in very strange ways. That's what I think is going on with the anti-racism movement. That's what I think is going on with the climate movement, for that matter, as well, which is a separate chapter in the book. But I do think it's a common thread that runs through the entire book, is that deeper hunger for purpose and meaning. It's also why I started the book with the first chapter, God is Real. Mm-hmm. If there's Blaise Pascal, he's a famous scientist who famously said, if there's a hole the size of God in your heart and God doesn't fill it, something else will instead. Yeah. He said that about 400 years ago, but he might as well have been talking about modern America.
Yeah, I want to talk about nationalism. You make a compelling
the N-word.
Yeah, the N-word. That's right, our modern N-word. Yeah. You make a very compelling case, and I agree with it, about the power of civic nationalism in America, and how it's really one of the only ways we can have some unity, especially as we've gotten to be a much more heterogeneous nation. You write at one point that in America, with the exception of Native Americans, everyone's an immigrant or a descendant of immigrants. I wanted to try an argument out on you. My colleague, Jeremy Carl, in his book, The Unprotected Class, about anti-white racism, says that immigration, of course, has been a powerful factor in American history, but in many ways, we're a nation of settlers, and we had a certain homogeneity, bracket the slavery question, of course, it's obvious, but a certain homogeneity for a long time. And it was the settlers and high birth rates and the descendants of settlers. Immigration played a part, especially in the late 19th century and through the 20th. But then in 1965, we have something very different. Now, your case for civic nationalism, I think, is a great one, and one that will shape our history going forward, given how diverse we are now after 1965. But do you think there's merit in drawing this distinction between settlers and immigrants, or are we kind of past that?
No, I agree with it. I think that there's a difference between somebody who views themselves as a passing, fleeting presence in an economic zone versus somebody who views themselves as rooted in a country. But the question is, what does it mean to be rooted in the United States? I think it means that you deeply subscribe to the founding ideals of the country, enshrined in the Declaration of Independence and codified in the U.S. Constitution. And I think that where I agree with the claim of the settler camp, I don't know where he is on this question, but I know many who would say the same thing have said things like, people won't die fighting for abstractions.
Mm-hmm.
Actually, I disagree with that. The American Revolution was fought by people who absolutely fought for the abstract ideals enshrined in our Declaration of Independence. Mm-hmm. Our geographic space is very different from what it was back then. It was 13 colonies on the eastern seaboard. Now we're a country where makes those 13 colonies just by the number of land, the amount of land, tiny compared to what our country is today. So I think the blood and soil argument for American national identity, where it falls short, is that it, A, makes American exceptionalism impossible, because most countries have their own national identity grounded in a blood and soil identity. Second, it makes, actually, many of those nations have a much stronger claim on national identity. Japan or in Italy has a much stronger claim on a national identity than the United States if it's about blood and soil and lineages. But I think what the United States is founded on is a commitment to those civic ideals that, right now, undoubtedly, if you applied the kinds of immigration policies I want to see, which is rigorous testing for not only civic knowledge, but commitments and allegiance to the United States of America, knowledge of our history. Malcolm X said it well, right? And a nation, something to the effect of, a nation without history, without a shared history, is like a tree without roots. You can see it, but it's dead. And I think that there's a strong case to view the United States of America in a very near similar way today. So I want to see immigrants who not only are going to make economic contributions, but have deep allegiance and knowledge enough to have allegiance to the United States, speak English, abandon citizenship, which is to say allegiance to any other country. Mm-hmm. I think that's important. But if we have an immigrant who has a better understanding of U.S. history, better allegiance to the United States of America, better understanding of our civic ideals, and a better ability to make economic contributions to this country than the modal person, or even than most people who are already born here in the United States, yeah, I do think that person can add value to the United States of America. Now, if we applied those stringent criteria, that would almost certainly, basically certainly mean less immigration than we have right now, which is why I would favor that. Not because I favor less immigration as a goal, but less immigration as the outcome of a principled approach to what an immigration system ought to look like. But I think that those who then fall into the trap of now saying that, no, how American you are is derived from how many generations you've been settled in the soil here, I think you have no unique claim of what American identity really is. American exceptionalism becomes impossible. And by the way, to bring it full circle, I don't know what you do with the Native American question at that point, right? Yeah. If your claim on a country is based on how settled you were on the land and who came first, then we're just fighting over the pieces, just like people have for the rest of human history. And I think America's more than that. And I do think that that's a raging debate on the right, and one we ought to have within the America First movement itself. And I don't think that necessarily before the election is the time for that to boil over, because I think we certainly have common goals of what we want to achieve in the country on the American right. But I think that this is a lurking discussion waiting to happen. Mm-hmm. And I, for my part, am pretty clear about where I stand on it.
Yeah. No, I didn't mean to draw the either or distinction. Just wanted to bring it up. It's as you say, it's a raging argument on the right.
Yeah.
And I love your recommendation, which I didn't realize that. I mean, it makes sense that it's not required, but requiring all congressmen and senators to be transparent about and declare if they have dual citizenship. I think that would it would infuriate everyone, but it's just common sense.
It's common sense. I mean, The reality is we ask them to disclose their financial conflicts of interest, right? We want to know whether the policies they're passing are advancing some other separate private goal of theirs financially. Well, if they have a different allegiance to a different country, they're literally a citizen of another country, can vote in the elections of that country, could be drafted to the military of that other country. I'd like to know that as a voter. That's a conflict of interest. And yet, I think if I may even, poke some fun, but it's not fun, it's serious. At our own America First movement, you have a lot of people who will say things like America First, and then just buckle and spines of jelly when it comes to this question of confronting dual allegiances through dual citizenship. Mm-hmm. Let's if we're America First, let's talk about that. What does it mean? And I think people can sort of puff their chests when it comes to immigration policy or protectionism when it comes to trade, but when push comes to shove on core questions of American allegiance, they're somehow nowhere to be found. And it's interesting how that works. But I'm very harsh on the left. I'm very harsh on hypocrisy or inconsistency wherever I see it. But I think it's only fair game to apply that 360 degrees.
Yeah, I agree wholeheartedly. Well, we're almost out of time, so I wanted to ask you an open-ended question, a kind of perspective question, if you're willing to indulge me. But before I do that, everyone should go buy Truths: The Future of America First. It's an excellent book and will be very useful to you, informative. But Vivek, I mean, you're in close contact with the Trump team. I'm not asking you to reveal any insider conversations, but what would you, if you were asked to serve in a next administration, should there be one, what sort of challenges would you like to tackle?
Yeah, look, I think President Trump and I have had some great conversations, and we're aligned that we want to change this country in the biggest possible way. And the roles for me, I think there's a couple of different paths that certainly others are speculating on, and I'm weighing. From everything from joining the cabinet to the Senate seat that opens up in Ohio, assuming President Trump, I hope, is successful. J.D. Vance, my good friend, also takes the vice presidency in that case. Hadn't considered the Senate before, but driving the legislative agenda, especially in this first few years, is going to be key. Yeah. And, I think there's a lot of people here on the ground in Ohio who are recruiting me. Probably most aggressively, the thing I'm being recruited for is to run for governor here in Ohio, which is, again, something that a year ago I hadn't considered. Yeah. But I am an executive by background. And, the problem of the administrative state and the regulatory state exists not just at the federal government, but in all 50 states as well. And so I'm keeping an open mind. I think that one of the things I've found in life is when you make your own personal plans, it doesn't go according to plan. But when you're guided by your purpose, the plan tends to reveal itself. And right now, my focus is on helping President Trump win this election, and also down ballot Republicans who I believe in to succeed as well. And, relatively soon, quickly after November 5th, we'll be making the right decisions about what my next step looks like in hopefully changing this country for the better.
Well, excellent. We'll look forward to watching that and watching your continued ventures into public service. Thanks for writing the book, and good luck with everything. And thanks for all you do for America.
I appreciate it, my man. Great seeing you.
Take care.
Thank you. Thank you.